Hello, welcome to JavaScript Jam. I am Ishan Anand, CTO at Layer Zero. Today's going to be a little different than usual. We have an interesting panel discussion of what is the Jamstack. There's been a lot of evolution in the space around things like incremental static generation, distributed persistent rendering, parallel static rendering, and it's caused a little bit of an identity crisis and a little soul searching as to what does Jamstack mean? Is it still purely static? And we had a lot of interesting discussion over Twitter. So we got a couple of the folks we were chatting with together for a panel debate on this topic. And our normal co-host, Mark Brocato, VP of Engineering at Layer Zero, is going to play the role of moderator. We also have Brian Rinaldi, he's the developer advocate at StepZen. Miriam Schwab, who's the co-founder and CEO of Strattic. Jeff Escalante, the engineering manager at HashiCorp. And Sean Davis, who works on developer experience at Stackbit. So with that, Mark, why don't I let you introduce yourself, and I will take a step back and let you moderate.
Yeah, so for once, I'm not supposed to be the opinionated one. So I'll be moderating. Mark Brocato, VP of Engineering at Layer Zero. I think we should start off just by going around and having everybody give us a little description of your background and how you work in the Jamstack space. So let's start off with Sean.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for having me. I've been in the web development space for probably about a decade or so, and up until the last year, spent that time in kind of various agencies and did some independent contracting there, but mostly building front-end marketing type sites. I kind of took this weird path to get to the Jamstack, or maybe not weird, I don't know. I learned web development through learning WordPress and PHP. And then pretty quickly, when I got that first agency job, jumped over to Ruby on Rails and spent a lot of time there. And I was in this small agency called Ample in Cincinnati in 2017 when we found out about the Jamstack and all the potential it had. We thought we could virtually cut our development costs almost in half. And so we threw out everything we had been doing with Rails and went all in on the Jamstack. And I really haven't looked back since then. And today still mostly focused on just building marketing type websites in the space.
Gotcha. Miriam?
It's interesting that you were connected to Ample. I've had some really good conversations with them. I was introduced to Taylor and someone else, and we've spoken a few times. They're amazing and doing amazing things. So that's very cool. My background is also web development, but with a very strong focus on the anti-Jamstack, WordPress. I founded a WordPress development agency and built it up to be the leading agency in Israel at the time. And we worked with a lot of corporations, high-tech companies that were looking for customized WordPress solutions for their businesses. Turns out a lot of companies use WordPress as their front-facing website, which you probably have seen, and they wanted to make sure that was taken care of properly. So did that for about 13 years. And then through my experience in the agency and with our customers and with the way that WordPress was going, in that it was becoming more attention needing, like hacking was increasing and performance was lacking and all that kind of stuff, which we all know. I started to explore other solutions, came across the emerging world of static site generators, and which became known as the Jamstack. Got very excited, realized that there were some issues with that, and WordPress still had a lot of benefits over it, and so thought, well, maybe WordPress itself can be a static site generator, and founded Strattic. I mean, it's not like I snapped my fingers and founded Strattic, but that was the transition, and been working on Strattic since for the last few years.
Thank you, Miriam. Ishan?
Yeah, so I'm CTO at Layer Zero. It's a slightly different route to the Jamstack. The previous company I did, MoveWeb, did a lot of things that kind of were precursors to the Jamstack from a non-static position that were really about, bringing the power of the CDN to bear in the performance of sites. So we were really early on a lot of the elements, like serverless, for example. We actually built out our own serverless infrastructure, almost in parallel to when Lambda was being developed. Did a lot of things that were also early forms of the Jamstack, like decoupling the front end from the back end. And at Layer 0, what we do now is we try to bring the benefits of the Jamstack to very large and dynamic sites that have frequent updates, where purely static techniques don't typically apply.
Thank you. Jeff?
Hey, I'm Jeff. I started kind of similar to Sean's story, which resonated with me in the agency world for a good number of years, like 5 to 7 years or so. And during that time, worked on a bunch of static site kind of like generation tooling. I had a static site generator that I maintained that was open source called Roots, and kind of this variety of other tools that we used at my agency to produce kind of like smaller to medium-sized marketing-oriented projects. We were also one of Netlify's earliest customers at this agency, and a weird and interesting fact about that relationship is that I designed Netlify's logo, which is always a fun thing to learn. After that, I kind of changed jobs to work at HashiCorp. HashiCorp's kind of like a DevOps software company. They are growing and scaling really quickly, and my team manages about 15 websites and apps that the company has publicly. Since then, I've kind of moved on largely from focusing on static websites for scaling and kind of flexibility concerns. So I'm probably going to be the bad guy on this panel.
And last but not least, Brian.
Thanks. So I got started with Jamstack, kind of, static sites back in I think it was 2013. I've been doing website development for like 24 years or so. And around 2013, I discovered Jekyll and became fascinated with the idea, especially because I was being told by work to build a WordPress site. Nothing against WordPress, Miriam, but I was just like, this. I was fascinated by Jekyll and really wanted to dig into it. I didn't win that battle at work. We did end up launching the WordPress site, but I kind of continued down that path. I ended up writing and speaking a lot about it. I wrote a couple of books for O'Reilly on static sites. I'm currently working on one for Manning with my friend Raymond Camden on the Jamstack, and I've kind of focused on that ever since. Currently, I am with a company named StepZen, so we're focused kind of on the back end side of the Jamstack, bringing all those data pieces together into a single GraphQL API that would serve as like the data behind your Jamstack application.
Great. Thank you, Brian. So the next question that I'd like to ask everybody is about your definition of Jamstack. How would you define it? And do you think that your definition is the consensus definition, or how much does it stray from it? And before I get started, many probably know this, but maybe not everyone does. Jamstack at least used to stand for JavaScript APIs and Markup, JAM. And who hasn't built a website with just JavaScript APIs and Markup? That doesn't seem like a great term, because like every website I've ever built in the last 20 years involved JavaScript APIs and Markup. So maybe that's why it needs a definition. So with that, let's go back to Sean and tell us, how do you define Jamstack, and do you think your definition is the consensus one?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that acronym, and that they have the community seems like they've largely dropped. But even when Jamstack in those early days was described as JavaScript APIs and Markup, I remember giving a couple of talks where I'd say Jamstack stands for JavaScript APIs and Markup. Now you know that. Now forget it, because it has nothing to do with what we're talking about here. And so I wrote this piece a month ago or so, and I was motivated because I found it really difficult to talk about what the Jamstack is. I mean, it was really fairly ambiguous even 5 years ago or so, but today it's evolved so much that I was thinking, All right, it doesn't mean much. At least to me, it's become this like really broad term that kind of is just describing modern web development. And so I took the approach in this article to say, well, I think Jamstack is an established community that's going to stick around. But if we don't kind of rein it in and put some bounds to what it means, then it's just this goofy buzzword for modern web development. And there's probably a better way to describe those things. And so what I did was I went back to the early days and thought, well, we know Netlify coined that term. And so it was definitely, and to a good extent today, still tightly coupled to the Netlify product offering. But like, what did that idea give us? It gave us sites that were more secure, easier to scale. We talked a little bit about developer experience and the potential for better performance. And so I thought, well, what are the kind of the core tenets that come out of that idea? And I came up with 4. I'll say I continue to kind of waffle as I have these conversations like this, because I'm getting more and more input all the time that I really like. But what I've said is, 1, the UI is compiled, meaning it's decoupled. The front end's decoupled from the back end. That was number 2, is that the front end is decoupled. The first one, UI is compiled, so we're not rendering in real time. We've already got the code that we need at that time. Number 3 is that that code is served from a CDN. And then the fourth one is that the deployments are atomic. And I'll say that's the one that I feel today kind of iffy about. Like the more conversations I have, the more it feels like atomic deployments are kind of like a byproduct of taking that other 3, the approach of those other 3. And so to answer your second question, and does that fit the consensus definition? I don't think so. I think I'm motivated more to say, hey, if this thing that is the Jamstack is going to stick around, what I really want is a way to be able to describe it, not just as modern web development, but as one specific architectural pattern in this landscape that is modern web development, and to be able to introduce the nuance of all of the different approaches we take today, which unfortunately those don't really have buzzwordy names to go with them as well. So that's kind of where I am. Awesome.
Thanks, Sean. I noticed you didn't specifically say static at all in that explanation, so we'll have to get into that more later.
Yeah.
So Miriam, how would you define Jamstack? And maybe to flip the question around a little bit, how do you think most people define Jamstack, and does that differ from how you define it?
Well, being in the WordPress world means that I see a lot of people who aren't developers like this group, and they don't know what Jamstack is. So if we're talking about the world, most people have no idea what Jamstack is. And I've tried to look at some data around the usage behind that term. And even among certain developer groups, it still hasn't stuck, or they aren't familiar with it. I think Netlify did a great job of pushing it out there, but it's still kind of like a burgeoning movement with very early adopters. So most people don't even know what Jamstack is. So I'll just put that out there. And actually, if you go to our site, you'll see that we talk about headless and static. We had an internal debate about whether we should call Strattic a Jamstack solution. And after surveying a bit and doing some research, we realized that most people would have no idea what we were talking about. And we see that when we talk to our customers as well. Some people know about it, most people don't. So that's the rest of the world. Within the Jamstack community, or people who are familiar with it, so from the beginning, at least personally, the term made me roll my eyes a lot, because I just felt like he was like, what rhymes with lamp? Jam. And it never made sense. It didn't, like you were saying, everything was JavaScript APIs and markup, like, or at least 2 out of 3 of them, so how do you say that is Jamstack and that isn't? It became, and I think it was just like a cool term and easy to like roll off the tongue type of term to describe a stack, like the next evolution or revolution in terms of a stack. And I think from that perspective, it's useful. It was good for branding, and it was good for creating some kind of more or less cohesive movement around this. Um, and at the time, it really meant static site generation, which helped because then you could at least associate it with that. But as you all kind of described, it in itself has evolved to the point where even its own name stopped meaning what it meant, which I think removes any, like, a lot of the weight from the term. And and it's, yeah. So I know that, like, saying modern web development is kind of just like meh. It's not very exciting. It's hard to get behind that. But I think that's where we're going, which is moving away from a particular stack and way of doing things that prevailed for a long time to promoting another way, which creates a better developer experience and in the end a better user experience. In terms of, like, if we're going to say, okay, Jamstack still exists just for the sake of being able to give this very amorphous group a name, I think that there's two aspects to it. One is the process of creating a web app or website that's Jamstack, and then the end result. And that's where I think people kind of fall into different camps. So from my perspective, which is not an objective perspective, Strattic is a Jamstack solution. We generate a static version of the site. We fully deliver it through a CDN. Things that Netlify kind of says, look, what's so cool that we have preview static, we have SSL, we have full CDN, and we have a lot of Lambda at edge stuff happening. So if you just look at the end result, we're Jamstack. But I have a feeling that a lot of people would say we're not, because the origin is not a pure. If we were just using pure headless WordPress, then people would be like, okay, I could see that falling into this category, but we're not. The origin, the point of origin, or the source of origin, or the point of truth is actually a regular WordPress site with a PHP theme and regular PHP LAMP stack functionality. And so then people want to kind of put us outside of that group, just fine. Like, people can put us wherever they want. I'm just saying that in terms of people's opinions and perspectives, it can go either way. What's the end result, and how did you generate that end result? And then that's how you fall into the Jamstack camp. So some people might say that Strattic is, some people might say that it's not. But in the end, we're generating a static site. It's headless, it's decoupled, regardless of how it got there. And we're like in a questionable place there, which I think is interesting in some ways. So anyways, that's my perspective on Jamstack.
Ishan, how would you define Jamstack?
Yeah, so I'll plug Brian's Certified Fresh Developer Events, CFE. Gave a talk where I really outlined this in more detail. The talk is called Evolving the Jamstack. And also, I'll also plug his newsletter, Jamstacked, where he also talks a lot about this. But my definition is I would totally admit non-standard. It's a bit, reducing Jamstack to what is the minimum required to derive the benefits of Jamstack. And for me, that is really just two things. Data is being served from the edge as much as possible, and it's done in a way that empowers front-end developers. And that's because the CDN is the linchpin for a lot of the benefits of Jamstack that we talk about, whether it's security or scalability. It all tends to derive really from the CDN. And then the other part of this is it's usually done in a way that makes it easy for a front-end developer to leverage and reason about. So, static, is really a Jedi mind trick to get you to write your page in such a way that the CDN can serve it. But there's more than one way to get the data there. And another element of this is, if you look at something like incremental static generation, it's using, somewhat traditional CDN patterns, but it's doing it in a way that you're manipulating it as a front-end developer from within your React code. You're writing your basically Next.js code. And that's, again, front-end developer empowerment. So it's a reinvention of old primitives in new ways that make it easier for front-end developers. And serverless then would also fall into that because it's scalability that a front-end developer would love because they don't have to worry about it. And so for me then, Jamstack's a spectrum. And it's basically a class of capabilities, and you could fall anywhere on that spectrum. But I'll readily admit something that I think we're all touching around, which is I think the term is going to be like HTML5 was a decade ago. It basically became an umbrella term that meant all modern web development. And at some point, it didn't distinguish from most web development to say you're doing HTML5, and it kind of effectively withered away and kind of won. Everything kind of ended up being like that. I think that's a model for what I expect will happen to the term eventually at some point.
Jeff, how would you define Jamstack?
Apologies in advance for this one, but I would not define it because I don't think it has a definition, and I don't think the word has any value. It originally, as has been mentioned, was a marketing term that Netlify invented to represent websites that can be hosted on Netlify, and it remains tightly coupled to that. As such, as Netlify has changed its hosting platform, it has also pushed changes to the definition of the word itself, causing the confusion that results in panels such as these. It's also been mentioned earlier that the word itself doesn't really make any sense or hold any value from its definition. The acronym part that it was originally invented under is not helpful, was never helpful, and is now no longer accurate. It's not actually a stack in the way that people describe stacks such as lamp stack or mean stack. And it's constantly changing definitions. Nobody knows what it means. Here we are in a panel all debating what it means and throwing out different definitions for it. Overall, I just don't think this is a word that people should be using at all. If we want to make the web development community more accessible to people that are trying to get into this field, we shouldn't be espousing words that don't make any sense and don't really have a definition and nobody understands what they mean. We should be trying to use words that are clear and accessible and understandable by everybody who wants to get into the field. So my plea to anybody listening is don't use the word Jamstack, and please avoid the word because it just makes everything confusing and worse for everybody in this field and in this industry.
So what would you...
Brian, that's a tough act to follow.
Yeah, well, the natural follow-up to that is what would you suggest we use as an alternative?
Describe your website in the way that it's being built. If you have a website that you're hosting on Netlify, say I'm building a static website I'm hosting on Netlify. If you have a website that you're pushing to CDN nodes in a specific type of way, say it. You can say what your website is without using Jamstack easily, and using Jamstack doesn't actually say anything. So I don't really think this is much of a challenge.
I'm going to disagree with that. Obviously, I think Jeff knows that.
I do certainly know that.
Yeah.
And you're welcome to.
This is why we gathered this audience.
I'm going to go back to why. I know we talked about Netlify created the term, obviously. But having been around working in that community with these tools at the time, the reason they came up with the term was there was a point to it. And it had to do with a number of things. I think, first of all, I can say having tried to sell companies on writing books about these tools and trying to sell my own companies on using the tools, that static sites was awful because you ended up in an extended discussion of can this actually handle what we want to build? It's like, well, yes, we can actually handle what you want to build. I know it says static sites, but it's not really static. We can do a lot, and so I struggled selling people on these solutions back in the early days. Jamstack kind of gave it, yes, it was a marketing term. Like serverless is a marketing term. Any of these terms are marketing terms, right? We come up with names. Some of them lose their meaning, like HTML5, although that was not necessarily a marketing term. It was actually a spec. But say even responsive web design now is kind of just web design. But it did help to define something that I could sell that didn't sound antiquated. Number one. And number two, there was no community. We were very siloed. It was very much like, I use Jekyll. Talking to people who use Jekyll. I use Hugo. I talk to people who use Hugo, but the community was very siloed. There was not a group of people who had even though we had a lot of overlaying like common problems we were trying to solve, because the tools were all had similarities, and the process we were building sites was similar. Like those connections didn't exist. We all just existed within these siloed communities. And that's my worry about, say, the approach that you have, Jeff, which is just like describe what you build. It's like, well, we're building things 1,000 different ways, and then we lose that kind of intersection of where we have common approaches to different pieces of these applications where we can share solutions. I think having this kind of term helps to build a community around that we can work together. We have these, I mean, you're on the Slack communities where I know I've received a lot of help, and we have conferences, and we have, and not just Netlify's conference, we have other events, we have books, it's a way to find your solutions. It helps people to define something that has some set of common problems that we're solving and find those solutions, as opposed to just, I'm just looking, in my tool, like I'm only talking to people in Next.js kind of thing. Even though my backend might have common problems with somebody who's doing Gatsby, as an example.
I mean, the root of your problem is that you personally had trouble selling certain clients using the word static. I don't know if that's a strong enough justification to introduce another word that may or may not actually mean static and confuse everybody with it. I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but like, you really have to think bigger than that.
No,
Jeff,
wait. I actually agree with, although I disagree with Brian, I'll agree with him on, like, getting people to adopt things is really important.
Yeah.
And he was actually trying to solve essentially a marketing function, right? And
Sure.
And so that, in some sense, I see both of you aligning on that. The value was in convincing people to go with this approach. And so I kind of actually see you guys on different sides of the same coin on that. And I'll agree with Brian on the community aspect. There wasn't as much energy around this space, and there is a community here, right? Like, I mean, I've gone through, there's at least 2 or 3, there's I think 3 or 4, I think I've counted at this point, landscape diagrams I've seen from VCs of the Jamstack space. There are books, as Brian mentioned, being written on it. It's being used by folks other than Netlify, even though Netlify created it. Is it too late to put that genie in the bottle in that term? And that's why I think I ask, what do we replace it with? Because there is a movement or a community here, and we have to put some name around it. Otherwise, if we don't, then you're not going to end up getting rid of it, which is, I think, your goal.
What is the movement and what is the community? Nobody knows what it is the problem. So it's really hard to name it when you can't define it.
Right. I think, Jeff, I agree with you that the name is devoid of meaning. And Brian, I agree with you that it served a purpose. It got a movement going, and it was able to shift people away from this term static, which we have problems with too. I go, it generates static sites. No, that doesn't mean that it's not dynamic. It doesn't mean that it's just like, a brochure. It also has dynamic functionality. We do have to explain it. So it is a problematic term. But I think that in order for this movement to continue to function under this term, the term does have to have meaning or some kind of definition that everyone can get under. But it sounds like there is, to some degree, because Brian, you're finding your community within, even though people are using different sets and subsets of the tooling and whatever and approaches. So what is it that brings everyone together under the Jamstack? And let's say the name could be blah stack, right? Like, it doesn't matter what the name is. It's Jamstack is the name that was created, and it's just like it's sticking. But what does it represent for now and potentially going forward? Because it does need to be something that is unifying.
And I will go back. I will say that when actually Matt shared the name with me before they officially announced it back in the day, and I said I hated it. And I have accepted. My answer was like, basically, I don't like it, but I don't have a better term to offer you as an alternative. And I think sounds like that's where we still are. And I mean, I disagree with Jeff, obviously, that there's no community here. There's no commonality here. I think we have settled on some kind of definition, even if it's kind of loose. But I also feel like I agree with Ishan that if we're gonna drop the name Jamstack, we replace it with something, because not having a name kind of sends everybody off into the wilderness. And we do have a community here, as we've seen with the things that have been built around the Jamstack. Even to the point that you made a good point, Ishan, about, I mean, we see VCs even like looking to invest in the Jamstack space. So it's built more than just like, say, a group of people on a Slack that talk to each other. There is actually even investments coming to looking to invest in companies that are working in the Jamstack space. So obviously there's something there.
And its competitors.
It's just,
It's Netlify and its competitors. I've done
Not
probably
only-
50
No,
or
no,
more
no, no,
phone
no,
calls
no.
with
I think
venture capital.
Strattic.
firms on
my
this
company's
topic.
considered in the Jamstack space. That's part of like where we got
Are
our
you a competitor
investments,
of
and
Netlify?
we're not Netlify competitors in any way. So I disagree with that completely. I've known.
Well,
seen
I mean,
lots of
isn't
people-
any platform a competitor of Netlify? Like, in a way? When we're asked to show our competitive landscape, it can go from all the way from hosting companies up to CDNs to like security solutions, meaning like there's a lot of overlap between the platforms. So almost anything is a competitor with Netlify. And even Strattic is considered Jamstack, and we have investors reaching out to us who are excited about the Jamstack space and excited about how we like sit between WordPress, whatever, it doesn't matter. But like, it's true. It did create a space also in terms of the economy on an economic level. So it does have that kind of clout.
Yeah, if you look at the CRV and Redpoint are the ones that come to mind. You know, they've done a landscape, and a landscape is not just the hosting pieces, but it's all the other pieces of that whole economy. So, I mean, if I was to take Jeff's, them and their competitors, it's them and their competitors, and then other parts of the ecosystem that partner into it, and that's the community. And then the developers. But then there needs to be a name for that space.
I guess I just feel like it fell apart once they dropped actually adhering to static. Like there was a very long time where you could genuinely only host static websites on Netlify, and where the term Jamstack genuinely was just another word for static. And then people slowly but surely started running into more and more scale problems with static and realized that static is not really quite all it's pumped up to be for like large, complex, like scalable websites. And then less static capabilities started getting added. And then the definition of the word became static and not static. And now you can do something that like probably could be described as Jamstack on like AWS. And you could do something that probably can be described as Jamstack where it dynamically generates every single page on demand and caches it. And you could probably call Ruby on Rails Jamstack at this point. And so the problem was that inflection point. And that's why when that inflection point happened, these types of panels and these types of talks that you've all been doing started coming up, because once you completely undermine the definition of a word and flip it backwards, it starts evaporating. So I'm not saying there is no community, as Brian said I did. I never said that. I don't think that's the case. I think the community was built around static websites. And a different word was used, as both Miriam and Brian have said, to describe static because they felt like that word wasn't flashy enough or sounded like it was boring or not modern or something like that. And now it's not static anymore. And so I think that the word needs to either continue adhering to what it used to be, or it needs to be dropped because we've moved on to a different type of thing where there isn't really a closed community where you can say, hey, you're running a site that dynamically generates pages. And so that's not Jamstack. Now nobody knows what it is because apparently Jamstack also means you can dynamically generate pages. So maybe the community is just web development in general, because anything could be this.
Or
So
maybe
I totally agree that it was the inflection point sort of the inflection point. I kind of felt like it was coming because they already were supporting serverless functions, but just not for serving page data. And then once you started doing it for actual page HTML, then it really was this identity crisis. And that was actually the original term I pitched to Brian for the title rather than Evolution of the Jamstack for that very reason. But, in some sense, I'll make an analogy here. This community still remains. and it's like electric cars. Like if you're, telling people about how great electric cars are, and then hybrid cars come along, although that wasn't their actual development, it's still a highly efficient vehicle that turns out to be more compatible to the existing infrastructure. And you're doing the community a disservice by saying this thing should also be considered. And so I feel, even if they brought these, non-static techniques, they needed to happen in order to bring, the principles and benefits of the Jamstack to more sites where those static techniques would not apply. So I felt like it was a natural and necessary evolution to evolve where those benefits could go.
I think it was necessary to drop pure static, which is why I moved on from it years ago, and said that in my intro. Like, it wasn't viable. It had to meld back into the normal flow. It split out because there was this overinvestment in dynamic sites in the Ruby on Rails peak era, right? Where everyone was doing, even for the simplest websites that were running up like a big Rails app. And so then there was this pushback to that. There was like a reverse kickback where it was like, hey, we should just use a simple static site. It's faster, it's more secure, it's cheaper, it's easier to host, it's easier to develop. Like, you've seen the benefits listed off.
Yeah.
And then we took that way beyond where it was supposed to go, right? So we said, all right, well, now that we can do static sites and they're better for these reasons, why don't we make everything a static site? And then we ran into this problem where it's like, okay, we've surpassed the point where static sites work anymore. So maybe we should go back to dynamic sites. So we've just come full circle. We have the web development community is young, right? This career field has only existed for less than a generation, right? We're like some of the more experienced people in the field, and none of us are like very old people. Right? It's weird to think about, but there are these wild swings in the industry where something happens and there's an extreme reaction to that, and then there's an extreme counter reaction. And I think that's the nature of this flow of events.
To follow on your analogy, Ishan, it would be like if we introduced those hybrid cars and then said, okay, now that we have hybrid cars and electric cars and gas cars, everything's just cars. And we don't distinguish.
I think that is what's going to happen.
No, but that's I think to Ishan's point that would then all of a sudden you lose there is value in the electric car versus in the hybrid car fitting into some kind of grouping that is much
fuel
more
efficient vehicles, basically.
Yeah. So but rather than just saying, okay, now that we've added these hybrid cars, suddenly everything is just cars, and we're not going to distinguish between those things. That's how I feel like that. My feeling, Jeff, is to kind of go along is that you still need to even if we don't have even if we don't use the term Jamstack, you still the distinguishing the architecture and methodologies that we use to build sites using these tools, that's different from, say, a traditional Ruby on Rails developer.
What is different though? I mean, I think it's being posed as static website building was better than Ruby on Rails, and that's why people adopted it. But I don't think that's actually accurate. It's better for certain specific situations and scale sizes, but you can still, and there still are many very successful Ruby on Rails apps that dynamically generate all pages and cache them. The same way that you could say a modern Jamstack site dynamically generates pages and caches them. So in the analogy, I think where it doesn't fit is that you could make a reasonably valid claim that gasoline consuming cars are objectively worse than electric cars, and that eventually all cars are going to be electric. And that is the plan in this country, if I'm not mistaken. However, I don't think that's the same with dynamic versus static websites. This community liked to pose it that way, that dynamic websites are not modern and they're old and they're worse. But they're not worse. They never were worse. And the largest internet businesses have always run on top of dynamically generated page architectures. It was just this weird little sub-community that developed where people had this superiority complex about static sites because they realized it was better for their small website. Sorry to be harsh about it, but I've seen it. It's true.
Well, so actually, let me take the analogy and just really drive it into the ground here. But what is a definition? Like, because it says stack in the name, I think maybe, Jeff, you're wrapped around the idea that it describes how the thing is built. And when I approached the term, I said, let's take a step back and actually describe the benefits derived. And that's what the term means. So if I was to take my analogy on cars, it would be this category called fuel efficient vehicles, right? We don't define how they actually, or energy efficient vehicles, right? We don't define how they're actually creating locomotion. We just say they do it in an efficient manner, and that is the chief benefit. Or like, to use it more, like Core Web Vitals doesn't describe a fast site, it describes the user perception of it, right? So maybe what we can say is, let's create a term around benefits that encompass speed, scalability, and stuff like that, rather than having to say...
Club.
The Good Websites Club.
We'll rename Jamstack. RIP Jamstack, that term's gone. We're calling it the Good Websites Club. I'm 100% down for that. Sign me up.
Okay.
I think you're getting to a point, maybe not the benefits, but the value system behind the approach. If you're talking about fuel efficient cars, well, maybe fuel efficient isn't your number one value. It's not my number one value. I own a Corvette, so. But you could say that maybe fast websites, reliable websites, edge hosted websites, cached websites, speaks to the value system behind Jamstack.
Every company wants.
So I wonder if
right.
No, but I think
everyone
maybe,
wants a good website.
But
who wants
Jeff,
a
I think
website?
you're like in a company, an organization, in like a space, or you've been in your career also where you have like a large, relatively large team working on web applications and a very sophisticated team. And so you are able to take whatever stack probably and then make a very high quality site. So I come from an industry where the websites tend to be pretty terrible. It's 42% of the internet, so it can't be ignored. And there's no question that the Jamstack approach generates much higher quality sites, much more reliable sites. I mean, we have customers that come to us after their sites were held by ransom, and they had to pay off with crypto and DDoS, and like low-level DDoS, right? Like, because a large swath of organizations do not have those capabilities around managing their web applications, even if they're tech companies. And then they're managing this like dynamic site, and it's a piece of garbage essentially, or it's not even a piece of garbage, but it needs like hand holding and tender loving care. It's very delicate flower. That's what I call WordPress. And so as soon as it's generated as static, everyone can stop thinking about it and just do their jobs. And so still there's
to scale up.
What?
Until you start becoming more successful, and then you have to start thinking about it again because you start running into the nasty edges of static.
Because
sites.
we're an end-to-end platform, we can take care of that for our users. Okay, I'm not saying the Jamstack, I know everyone's patching together their own solutions, so they can't, but we can. We have different forms of publication, and so we can take care of larger sites, and as the sites on Strattic grow or get bigger, so our capabilities to support them get bigger, because we are end-to-end, we control everything. I know that's not typical, but if we can do it,
sort of is.
I think that others can do it as well. And so I would like to see the Jamstack continue to kind of stick to its origins, because I still am a big fan of like a statically generated site, because it's just so smooth and reliable, and just like it changes the paradigm of what a dynamic website is completely, turns it on its head. And so it just makes the whole internet, I think, better in many ways. For a lot of people who don't have like big sophisticated teams around their web applications to keep them running well. So like, let's say,
by the way.
Okay, thank you. So let's say the Jamstack.
But there is a certain point where that falls apart. There's a large swath of like your use case. Like it's the same thing with all software. Like use the best tool for the job. And I think there's a lot of websites where a static generated website is the best tool for the job. And I will absolutely stick to that anytime you hear me talk about it. However, you do also have to acknowledge that there is a swath of websites for which static website is not the best tool for the job as well. And you
I
just
would
have
really
to
like
look
to
at
see
what's in front of
Jamstack,
you,
like stick as much as possible to static, and then with exceptions. So like if you're running a certain type of site and there's certain areas that are like being updated more, so that becomes more dynamic, whereas the rest of it stays static, and like not being too extreme about how we approach it, and sticking to the origins as much as possible. I think that's how I would see the Jamstack, while recognizing the limitations of it, and then implementing dynamic functionality. By the way, I wrote this in the document that we shared, but when I first saw the term server-side rendering or SSR shared within the community, I was seriously laughing. I was like, well, where did we get to now?
Same.
That's what everyone was like trying to get away from. And now we have a new term for it. It's just a dynamic website. So anyways, just
Well,
like
what
to
I
share
thought
that.
was funny is it was introduced almost like it was a new concept. I'm like,
Yeah,
that
exactly.
sounds like what I started doing 25
Yeah,
years
like
ago.
everyone is like, yeah, we've all been doing that. This is not a new concept. It's nice you gave it a new shiny short form, but it's still dynamic. Anyways,
Everybody's
Same as
just chucking the hot
Jamstack is
potato
dynamic.
around. Nobody wants to own the compute. It's either going to be during the build process or during the runtime process.
or if we
Everybody
give it
knows
a
that's where
different
the danger is.
name, then it's not that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's still that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I want to
totally
hear from
agree.
Sean.
Yeah,
go
because
ahead, Sean.
I was going to say, really agree with what Miriam's saying. Where I like to say you want to start simple if you can. Like there's no reason to start with the most complex solution just because it's cool. And I think that's kind of what you're saying, Jeff, as well. Like if the Jamstack offers simplicity, doesn't necessarily require it. But I think what I really struggle with today, with if we're going to bring the car analogy back, is that I understand that you can say fuel efficient vehicle and it describes the end result of this, how this car works. What I struggle with is we kind of like we're sort of talking about this Venn diagram where what Jamstack was originally is this like simple static idea, and then we've got the Ruby on Rails site, which is maybe a better fit for big complex websites and applications, and then we had Next come in and like totally change the game on us, and we're like, oh wait, we can do both with the same platform, and it doesn't feel like we're working to find a good way to describe that thing, and maybe hybrid's the best word for it, but instead we're trying to stretch the definition of Jamstack, and then we end up in this gray area. Like, is DPR, ISR, are those Jamstack sanctioned patterns, or like does that go beyond Jamstack? And so that I think that's where I'm stuck today. Is like, how do we talk about this hybrid approach, which is a really valuable approach in some cases? And like, what's that community? Is that just you're part of the Jamstack community or the Rails community or the Next community? Like, where's the middle ground, and where should we talk about that?
For me, what distinguishes it from what's come before, again, is the front-end developer empowerment. You could always cache things. You could put a CDN in front of Ruby on Rails. But the way you interact with the cache in incremental static regeneration, for example, is different. You're not looking at cache control headers. You're just putting you're writing get static props or get initial props, and like that's a different way of interacting with caching and thinking about it, that you don't have to think about it in the same way. And even if you go back to your original static, it's a way of using the cache that you don't have to think about the fact it's being served from the CDN. Like if you tried to do like classic web development, we worked with customers on this. And we'd say, you cache this entire page, and there'd be things like the cart count, this is on an e-commerce site, or the hello Bob, welcome back. And we're like, okay, late load that. And you don't do that kind of after the fact. But if you start from this is a static website, then that Jedi mind trick gets you to say, oh, I'm just going to dynamically load that in, right? Okay, because I know I don't have a server. And so for me, that's the crucial difference for what we're doing in the Jamstack that came before, is that we're using these old primitives in new ways, further up the abstraction. It's kind of like serverless. Like there's servers there you don't think about. The internet is routerless. You don't think about the routers. They just kind of come naturally. And that for me is the innovation that remains, and why we can put a box around this community.
So I'd hate to give Ishan the last word since he's my coworker. So I feel we're getting at time, but I figured maybe we'll wrap up with Brian. Brian, what do you think are like the most important values that have come out of this Jamstack community, if there is one? And is there anything else that you'd like to say in closing?
So you give me the last word. Okay. All right. So I would say, I think first of all, everybody's made some really good points here, and I think Ishan's last point there is well taken. That it's flipped around the script a little bit of how you build these sites. Where even I've talked about like thinking in Jamstack, where it's a very different way of thinking than when I did traditional server side applications, where every request was a response from the server, and that was easy for me to think about. And I wasn't thinking about like, oh, is this rendered at build time? Is this rendered on the server? Is it rendered sometime after? And all those things. So I think there is a way of thinking that's very different when you approach a Jamstack site. I think the key thing is the thing that I emphasize to people is I think it can include some dynamic stuff, but it's a static first approach. I pre-render as much as possible, and then dynamically add things in as needed, even if that includes like I have a handful of routes that are fully dynamic. And I agree with Jeff and others who have mentioned that we don't need to be rigid about this definition to the point of like, that's Jamstack, that's not Jamstack kind of thing. I mean, I think part of that whole community aspect that we talked about early on is that we have a set of commonalities, that like common problems we're trying to solve, even if we're using different tools and our approaches are slightly different. And there are part of this is about finding ways that we can help each other and learn from each other's approaches and build better websites.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Brian. And thank you, everybody, for participating in this panel. I'm interested to see if maybe in a year or so we see how this all pans out and come together again to figure out what to call it. So thanks again, everybody. And I'm sure we'll have everybody's contact info in the description on the video. So if you heard something out there that you strongly don't agree with, go after them. See you later.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.